migration, particularly out of Africa, has become a contentious issue around the world. The New South Institute has published some research on migration governance reform. To talk about some of the findings, I'm joined now by Professor Alan Hirsch. A very good afternoon to you, Professor. Thank you so much for your time. I mean, this is an issue of great contention around the world. What new perspective does this specific report offer on the dynamic relationships between migration, integration and development across the continent?
Afternoon, Paul. Great to be with you. Well, this is the first report in a series of reports which we're going to be bringing out over the next 18 months or so as part of the project at the New South Institute, and it's the framework report. But in preparation for the report, we've done quite a lot of research already. And what we're finding is that we have a lot to learn from each other in Africa about ways of moving forward in migration. Some African countries have moved, quite swiftly. Even some of the richer, stronger countries in Africa, where, richer countries are often afraid of opening their borders too much because of the desire of people from poorer countries to get jobs and access to welfare services and so on. But there are ways of doing it, and there are ways of doing it within regional organizations, particularly in East Africa and West Africa, which seem to be working quite well. So we can learn from the rest of the world as well. We can learn from South America, where actually they've made quite remarkable advances in the last 20 years. And obviously we can learn from the European Union, where they've, reached a really high level of integration and development. But part of the African integration story, you can't really have a full African integration story without a significant freedom for people to move across borders. And without integration, Africa is going to be limited in the pace and the degree to which it's able to develop. So
how does this research now scrutinize the capabilities of state institutions as well as the political and economic conditions influencing migration trends?
Well, we do that. The New South Institute is very much about looking at governance, about institutions and how effective institutions are. And that's a part of the story. So we're going to be looking at institutions. We're already working on a couple of country case studies. South Africa and Nigeria are first up. And then we're looking at Mozambique and Kenya. And then we're going to be looking at some regional organizations in Africa as well, including SADC, ECOWAS, the East African Community, and the African Union. And in that, we'll be looking both at the circumstances and at the institutions. And the circumstances include things like how developed are the regions? What is the amount of equality or inequality within countries and between countries? Because that can be a big factor. And how do you manage that? What are the social provisions? If somebody works in one country, do they get their welfare services in that country? Are they transferable across borders within regions? What are the key ingredients, the key institutional ingredients of a successful integration of that kind? And it's not easy. I don't think. The last thing I would like to suggest is that it's an easy thing. In fact, the reason we're engaged with it is because it's one of those really complex problems that needs a lot of research, a lot of thinking, a lot of discussion, a lot of engagement with policymakers, which we're trying to do as well.
So what about the challenges of open African borders, especially considering factors like poverty, inequality, and so forth?
Well, they're, I think, our ultimate target. I think, within Europe, it's possible because the degree of inequality between the countries in Europe isn't very large. And Europe had quite tight conditions for participation in the European Union, which meant a certain amount of democratic accountability and a certain level of development effectively. Europe was also able to provide a lot of funds for development for the poorer countries in the regions, which meant that they were able to develop and that their people got richer. Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and Greece were all very poor countries when they came into the European Union and got a lot better off. It's very difficult to do that in Africa. We don't have the resources to do that in Africa, so we're going to have to do it more cleverly, probably more slowly, and more strategically. But it's going to happen, down the road we'll get there. The question is, what are the best paths for getting there? And it's a combination of things. It's a combination of countries deciding that they want to take the initiative and open their borders, and a few countries have, especially some of the smaller countries and some of the island states where borders are easy to manage. Countries have moved towards e-visas or visa-free travel. South Africa, in spite of our reputation as being quite protectionist, we have more and more partners in other parts of Africa where we don't need visas to visit, and they don't need visas to visit us. And as countries develop the kind of institutional systems that we can trust, passports, criminal justice system that we know that they're not allowing criminals to enter our borders, and various other things. As that level of trust develops and as that level of sophistication develops, we'll move further. But it is going to take a while. The questions we're asking is, how can we accelerate that a little bit?
And of course, it will need some stakeholders and a lot of integration to ensure that those strategies are realized and become effective.
It's true, and when you enter the stakeholder conversations around immigration, it's much easier to find people who are afraid of uncontrolled integration than people who are in favor of some degree, at least, of liberalizing integration. So within countries, it's very hard to find those alliances that are going to promote integration, even in a steady way. And in fact, the political rhetoric is such that virtually every political party in South Africa, for example, has a degree of fear of foreigners in its political strategy. It seems to be almost impossible to get elected if you don't do that. But in spite of that, there are progressive policies, including by our government in many important respects. So there are a lot of stakeholders the loudest stakeholders are those with something to fear. We need to give voice to those who have something to gain as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. Let's perhaps leave it there for now. Professor Alan Hirsch, there speaking, of course, as a on migration governance reform, just summing up that discussion.